This is our fourth and final video dealing with political geography, and just so you know, it's the final video for the class. Again, you should be reading chapter 8 in the textbook. Let's start with our learning objectives. There are 4 for this video. First, we're going to look at the 4 main reasons why the European Union was created in the first place. What are the benefits? Why would anybody do this? Then we're going to move on to this idea that not everyone in Europe is a supporter of the European Union. The people who don't support the European Union go by this term right here. They call themselves Eurosceptics. They're skeptical that the European Union is a good idea. And so we'll look at what is meant by that term and how it's being expressed. Finally, we're going to point to 2 issues that are basically problems for the success of the EU. Outside of the current financial crisis that's going on in Europe, there are 2 deeper, more profoundly important problems. And one has to do with the fact that the EU has some really huge disparities in per capita income. Some countries are rich and some countries not so rich. And so there's a lot of inequality that could lead to the undoing of the European Union. There's also a lack of cultural uniformity and, more importantly, kind of a common thread, a common language, a common lingua franca, whatever it might be. And that makes European identity relatively weak. And so there's also a problem there. So let's move on to firstly looking at why the European Union was created. In other words, we're basically asking, hey, what are the advantages of the European Union? Why not just have 27 individual states? Why try to bring them together? Why merge them into one single state? What's the point of that whole enterprise? Well, probably the most important, but nobody talks about it anymore. It would have been really important back in the 1950s and in the 1960s, is the idea of peace. Imagine that Europe has basically had 2 horrible wars in the early part of the 20th century, World War I and World War II, both fought largely in Europe, killing millions of Europeans, destroying huge numbers of European cities. So in the aftermath of World War II, European leaders took a look around and said, my God, what have we done to ourselves? How can we prevent this from ever happening again? And what they thought, quite logically and correctly, is that if they weave all of the European states together, make them economically dependent on one another, it would be really difficult for one of those countries to start a war. And they thought then that the European Union would be kind of a safety valve. It would stop the possibility of another full-fledged cataclysmic war in the heart of especially Western Europe. And that, of course, was especially the case in Germany, meaning the people who live in France and Poland and Belgium, who were victims of German militarism and aggression in the first half of World War II, were looking for a way to kind of tie Germany down, to make the Germans see that they, in fact, had their economic lot basically in with the rest of Europe. And this would be a way to subdue Germany, if you will, to kind of tie it down with the rest of Europe. And so there's kind of a special case here in terms of emphasizing this idea of peace, especially when you think about the relationship between Germany and its neighbors. To reiterate the main point, though, if you make all of these economies interdependent, weave them into one another, less likely would be the case that any one country would go to war, because they'd basically be going to war with their marketplace, the people who buy their goods. There's another reason. It has to do with creating a counterweight to the dominance of the United States on the global stage, both politically and economically. Imagine this. After World War II, the European military powers became really weak, and the American economy really grew. So the post-World War II period, from 1945 to the present, you really have a world that's basically dominated by the United States. And in some ways, Europe was jealous because they used to rule the world. Back in the 19th century, when Europe was the big colonial power, and there was a sense of loss here. And so to kind of counterweight a world dominated by the United States, there could be a creation of a single European state that would better balance the world system. That was part of the thinking. So let's look at some of these factors. In terms of population, the European Union is clearly bigger, with 500 million versus our roughly 310 million here in the United States. The economy of the European Union overall is about the exact same size as the American economy. And then also the rising importance of the euro as that single currency they created in the European Union has in some ways challenged the dominance of the dollar, the American dollar, as the kind of financial gold standard, if you will, for global capitalism. And so it has made Europe more important in a financial sense on the global stage. There is a third reason. It has to do with problem-solving abilities. I'll give you just one example. The Baltic Sea is a low sea. It's not very deep, and it was historically quite polluted because it has a lot of industrial cities on it. Well, none of the individual states in Europe that face the Baltic could just alone solve the problem of pollution in the Baltic Sea. But if they all came together, Poland, Germany, Sweden, and so on, they could kind of marshal their collective resources and target this problem. And that's what they've done. So the European Union has allowed Europe to clean up the problem of pollution in the Baltic Sea that probably would not have been addressed as effectively had it been the case that there was no single European Union in which to address those problems. And then finally, there is just the idea of prosperity, meaning if you create a system of open borders that encourages trade, this is going to lead to greater levels of economic activity. It could also foster economic efficiency and more broadly economic growth. And so some of the thinking behind the European Union is each one of the individual European states could grow more quickly if in fact they created a bigger marketplace. And in some ways that has been exactly what has happened. For example, Germany, they have a lot of manufacturing. And in a single European marketplace, they can sell whatever it is they make to a bigger marketplace. So those factories are building and making more things, they're hiring more workers, and so on. So some economies have done really well as a result of the creation of a bigger and wider European Union. Let's talk about these skeptics, though. Not everyone in Europe is a fan of the European Union. There are some countries, for example, that flat out rejected the use and conversion to the euro. The reason they did so is because they thought about it and they said, you know what, we still want to have our own currency. We don't want it controlled by a distant capital. We want to control our currency in our own capital city. So I'll give you just two examples of countries that said, no, we don't want to use the euro. One is the United Kingdom. They did not convert to the euro. They still used the British pound. And thus they maintained control over their currency in their capital city of London. Everything on this map that is color-coded blue, they did convert to the euro. So another example is in Sweden. For whatever reason, the Swedes decided that it was more important to them to keep control over their currency, the krona, and not convert to the euro. So on the edge of Europe, especially here on the northern edge of Europe, there is a little bit more euro skepticism. They're not 100% certain if they want to join in a very full-fledged kind of way. Now, two other additional issues that I want to point to have to do with what we might call the structural problems of the EU. Can the EU survive as a supranational entity deep into the 21st century? One of these problems has to do with economic disparity within the European Union. Now, this is a hard graph to read, but it basically gives us GDP per capita. It's called GDP PPP, which just means they're controlling for variances in the cost of living. It stands for purchasing power parity. Don't worry about that so much, though. But notice this. Luxembourg, Ireland, Denmark, Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, They all have GDPs per capita around $30,000, so they're pretty wealthy. But down here in Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, and Latvia, GDP per capita is only about 10,000 American dollars. That means some parts of Europe are 3 times as wealthy as the other parts of Europe. That's a big disparity. And if you know the geography of this, that actually is going to be important. These are primarily Western and North European countries. These are primarily Eastern and South European countries. So the farther north and west you go in Europe, typically the wealthier it is. The farther south and especially east you go in Europe, typically the poorer it is. So if we can imagine that map of the European Union we looked at in the previous slide, we know that a lot of those East European countries, Slovakia, Estonia, Lithuania, and so on, the newest member states are relatively poor. And that means it's going to be kind of expensive and difficult for the European Union to integrate these economies fully into the European Union system. They may pull it off, but it makes it a little bit more strategically difficult than it otherwise would have been had they not admitted these East European countries. Now, one final thing that I want to point to is this. Remember that European flag that we looked at? They're basically trying to craft a European identity. And for this to work, the European leaders basically have made the argument that people in Europe should start identifying as European first, and then whatever their nationality is second. So, for example, you would say this: I am European, I see that European Union flag, oh, and by the way, I'm also German, because that's what I speak, and that's what my ethnic identity is. But the European Union's bureaucrats and leaders would kind of prefer that European identity came first. Well, guess what? They did a survey recently, and what they found is that even in places like Germany, where it's actually quite high, only about 22% of the population identified as European first. In other words, an overwhelming majority of Germans said, I'm German, then I'm European, perhaps. And guess what? It's in Germany actually where European identity was the strongest. In places like Greece, Denmark, and Britain, it was much lower. So in the case of Denmark, it's really only 1 out of every 20 people said, yeah, I'm European first and Danish second, which means 19 out of 20 said, I'm Danish. And I suppose way down on the list is where I think of myself as European. What this means is that unlike the United States of America, where pretty much everybody says, I'm American, then they say, I'm a Wisconsinite or whatever it might be, it's the exact opposite in Europe. And so it's going to take a long time before people in Europe start identifying with this idea of a European state, or this idea of a European single cultural identity. And there is just one final note that I will point to. What do these countries have in common? Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. These are the 4 countries that had the greatest level of European first identity. They were more likely to call themselves European. These are the core countries where we had those founding members. So these are the countries that have been members of the European Union the longest. So it would kind of make sense that that's where European identity is most well developed and expressed. These places, on the other hand, are newer and they're on the periphery. So it certainly seems to reason, it makes quite a bit of sense that it's in those places where European identity is more weakly expressed and people still cling to their national and ethnic identities. That is our last point for our final video respecting political geography.